what lies in the future. We look into the past, but these memories only last as long as the culture that wishes to perpetuate them. What do we perpetuate? Is it ever too late to seek justice? Just in time. Ran out of rhymes. In the meantime, I just want to throw a reminder that we probably aren't quite there yet, but we carry on regardless. What lies in the future? Who are we to judge what could come up, apart from the fact that we are the ones who determine the future ourselves? So I guess it's always time to judge and rethink and look into the future, and not only dwindle in the past and try to learn from it, but to reinvest into what we can do to make our history. Obviously, in the UK, it's what is known as Black History Month. It's also some other things, but whatever. The most notable thing is Black History Month, and the first thing I thought about is what comes to mind when you think of Black History Month and think about the past and what we look back on and the general tropes and the same characters show up over and over again. Is what seems to be the common experience of someone like me growing up in like a inner city part of London. What do we learn about every year? The classic things. And the first question that I always thought about is, are we too USA centric in terms of how we look at Black history? Of course, Martin Luther King being a towering figure, is that still the only thing that prominently comes to mind? I mean, you might look at, say, Nelson Mandela, for example, or other people. I mean, and then you go back to thinking, oh, what about the UK? And then you still get a similar vibe of the same kind of characters, at least from what I've seen in the mainstream, at least. You get the Mary Seacoles, for example. Trevor McDonald, I think, is starting to become a bit of a staple. I mean, even Kent Union couldn't mess that one up, for example. But yeah, that's another interesting thing, Kent Union. But I won't go on that tangent. I should upload that video, though, by the way. And I think about how Black History Month has become a bit of a meme almost that just keeps coming back every year. A bit like Christmas. You have the same kind of jokes and the same kind of shows on TV and the same kind of discussions and the same food. We have that same thing about Black History Month becomes a bit limited to concepts of overcoming adversity, for example. A lot of that is about the black struggle, let's say, in the legal sphere, as we see in USA, and the fact of USA itself. A lot of that is big, which obviously is a sign of American culture permeating through most of society, especially in the West. But there's also the thing about what are we ignoring, what are we not acknowledging as part of Black history within our own communities, within our own spaces, what history has occurred in the past 60 years, like ignoring prior to, 1970 and earlier, what has occurred in 25 years' time. I mean, I was lucky enough, for example, to meet Lenny Henry 2 weeks ago, or last week even. And, for example, what does Lenny Henry mean to Black history, especially as someone I thought notable because of how he basically came into the business. He said basically it seemed a bit of as a token in a way, and then he got to really realize his own talent, which is quite interesting. He was signed up onto a show that wasn't seen as diverse enough, and then he got added on partially as a token attempt, and how he got to develop. That's one man who's come about, after the big legal struggles of, prior to the 70s, for example, if you're talking about Western Black history. And I say Western Black history because there's a question of Black people existing in other parts of the world and what have they done, other notable things. Newscasters, for example, is the one that comes to mind. It's all these things. But if we're talking about local things, I mean, me locally, inner city Londoner, I say a notable thing, after 1980, at least, or 1990 even, is, the rise of grime into the mainstream. We have at the very least, you know, it's the classic thing. Obviously, you know, black people, inner city black people, only really find a way out of their socioeconomic backgrounds, often through the arts or through sport. There is still that kind of common trope, it seems still, but regardless, the rise of grime into the mainstream is quite a notable point. Like this past quinquennium, the past 5 years, is quite a notable point in black history, and we will look back at this and say, oh, remember from 2000, we'll say from the beginning of the 21st century, we had the rise of, you know, grime and whatnot, and what that means, you know, to people in the future. And then relating back to that whole thing about, is this the only way to still get out of the ends, for example, and how much have we been able to deal with the grassroots issues of, you know, economic disparity and all these other things, and, you know, how society and groups and communities are treating each other in the past. These issues that made the legal struggle what it was, that, you know, that normalized the injustice, you know, because regardless of how much legal ground is covered, it's still the issues that still underlie that made the allowance. The people that got into those powerful positions as legislators, they came from communities, and what issues still persist in those communities that make the allowance for such injustice, or make it feel like it's not even an injustice at all. And, you know, these are the questions that come up. Nonetheless, there's a range of history to explore and a range of things that we will look back on the future. I wanted to also look back at Black History Month as a concept, and the thought that there's this, obviously the classic complaint from, you know, your average, you know, what one would say quite out of touch non-black person who has this complaint about a whole month dedicated to black people, and then there's the classic rebuttal of that sniff, that, you know, this is the only month black people have, you know. And then there's obviously that big question of how do we integrate black history into the mainstream. You know, that's another question. When I use at least the phrase black future, that's a thing to consider. Like, how do we actually move to integrate things into the mainstream, you know? And then therein lies this weird issue, especially at least in the West. I keep going back to, I say Western black history just to make it clear what we're talking about. Does Eastern black history exist? Apparently it does. I mean, the issue in the West is that, you know, black people have only been seen as three-dimensional persons for 200 years or so, if that. So of course, Black History Month that we learn in, you know, England, maybe France, USA, is Black History Month in relation to the Western powers. Just like other history, we learn about it in relation to powerful people, mostly powerful men. Other than queens, do we study enough women, for example, you know? And we learn about in relation to powerful people. You know, we have the movement from feudalism into, you know, the colonial kind of era, and then into like industrial revolution, and into our modern, like, you know, democratic capitalist society that we have going on in most parts of the West. You know, and then this question of how much is seen as fully relevant for the average child, say 13 years old in history class, you know, that he's able to, he or she, or they, we'll go for the they for the simplicity, is able to access without too much adversity, you know, or how much is still held behind this wall of, say, university, and having to really become a specialist to really explore a range of things. In essence, how much history is out there, black or otherwise, you know, that is able to be accessible. And maybe that's one of the biggest hurdles, being able to access information, you know, to have discussion groups and have, I want to have 14-year-old kids be able to pull information from the internet or libraries and have discussions. What about this issue? What did this mean? What did this notable point, 1802, mean in terms of how, you know, the West related to black people? How much do we know about parts of Africa prior to 1400? For example, how many records are available? Can I at least find out how much information is out there so I can dive in? But on top of this, you look at things like the idea of being African mixed with being black and being black in itself. And obviously there's, you know, the simple fact that being black or being African, these are not nationalities. These are not necessary things. It just so happens that I am black, for example. I because of, primarily geographical and biological factors. This is how humans work. My ancestors are in a place where, being black was the mainstream thing. And then there comes that question of how tied are we to our ethnic backgrounds, and in the future, how tied will we be? Will it not change too much? How much will it change over time? Of course, my hypothesis is that above all else, socioeconomic class will be the one thing, or the one longest enduring division amongst all of us, amongst us Homo sapiens on this planet. Race seems to be obviously quite a big issue in other realms, other societies, like that thing I showed you with the Chinese thing. Homogenous societies, or racially, ethnically homogenous societies, still experience issues. You have things like the Rohingya Muslims, for example, that are, ridiculously, to put it in a nice political way, ridiculous maltreatment is the nicest way I can put it. Ludicrous levels of maltreatment, effectively like a genocide. And how much will we be tied to these things compared to, say, socioeconomic class? And if Black Future features a world, or Black Future exists in a world where, we don't tie as much to race. Now, of course, we would still look back on Black history and the sheer fact of, being black meant something. It meant certain things, and communities and certain culture, like grime, for example, came about because of primarily black neighborhoods and, for example, mixing together, and this is how it came about. In the same way, I, for example, live in Elephant Castle. You have like Latin, like quite a Latin influence on the area, for example, because of thousands of people that live there. And the question is, are we able to integrate amongst society and whatnot? This makes me think, obviously, with integration comes like a small death, you could say, in the sense that often we become one culture or one nation, moving from ethnicity and all these backgrounds into nationality and maybe ideology backgrounds, and how you meet up people with the internet because you have things in common, you have maybe similar ideologies. And the idea of ethnicity not meaning as much, especially me being a Londoner, ethnicity is like the third thing I think of, because I don't attach as much to it as I do, to, you play Smash Brothers competitively, for example. I think is a more defining factor of how much, we can interact with each other by a country mile compared to racial backgrounds. However, when I meet someone who's the child of a West African immigrant as well, there's naturally that little connection, because our parents will have similar background and similar things, because we're still at that turning point where I feel, the amount of, say, black people or any other ethnic background still means something. But as the things that did determine racial differences, like geography and like our connection to the rest of the world, and, being able to have, super awesome mixed race babies, wow, declines, there will be that weird kind of shift. And I think we're maybe at the precipice, the true precipice of that proper shift into, as we see, into ideological groups are still quite matched up, but of course there's still quite that ethno-nationalism, for example, where nationalism makes sense, I guess, as a group, and you see it as, national values, but the ethnic side is probably the thing that either will decline or will see its own demise because of the unsustainability of it, and how that has led to things like the wars in the past and whatnot. But anyway, generally I see this as the precipice of Black Future being one where maybe we can either move towards the greater class struggles. In a sense, Black History Month and any other history month will relate more about the overcoming of adversity, but also maybe about the little things that we still have in common, as black persons, black British persons, or, any other persons. Long story short, I obviously can't predict the future, but I do believe if we are to firstly move on from the issues that we did suffer in the past, there has to be a certain movement away from obviously the grassroots issues that cause them. You know, the views and how we see each other and how much we attach to things like race, gender, and whatnot. But on top of all else, my screen's flashing. It looks a bit weird. A reminder: take reminders from history, learn from history, to really explore and maybe try and change what we have, so we don't have the same stories. We have more stories outside of overcoming adversity, stories of, you know, just rising up, stories of intrigue, stories of cultures, isolated or not from each other. I aim for integration, but isolated or not, we have stories of cultures and just general history, the same way we look at, I don't know, something, what's really banal or something really weird, or how Oliver Cromwell cancelled Christmas, quote unquote. You know, that's an interesting part of history. I mean, do we call that white history? I call that British history because it's Britain history. You know, so maybe that's the move that happens, move to nationalism. However, me being quite cynical, and my cynicism being relatively well founded in the past few years, we'll probably have Black History Month as it exists for years to come, and Black people and other races will still have more than more than what I believe separates them, in the sense that above just the simple things, you know, just being Black and what that means, being, say, West African, I think means more. Like, I don't really feel like I have a lot in common culturally with a South African person, for example. But yeah, me being cynical, I'd say it's going to remain in the state of affairs in the world where, you know, race still is quite a bit of a determining factor. Of course, you know, my own experiences recently, at least, obviously support that idea. Because, you know, lack of opportunities, lack of connection means that, you know, you can't get to things, and therefore, you know, races stay segregated somewhat. And from that, I just feel that we need to push more for culture and push more for just expression of selves, expression without, you know, adversity, with and without. I've waffled long enough, to be honest. Anyway, happy Black Future Month. I hope you can explore who you are within self and create a future for other generations to look back on and say, hey, that was a really great thing. I want to supersede that and aim even higher and make an even greater impact on our world.